The EU is moving to charge airlines for their carbon footprint just for taking off or arriving in any European Union country. But the tax doesn't just apply to time spent over EU airspace. It's for the entire trip. That means if a U.S. airline is flying from Chicago to Paris, the EU will tax that plane for the time spent in American airspace. China and India have already said, screw you, EU. They're not going to pay. So why should the U.S. pay? Joining us now is Republican Senator John Thune from South Dakota. Senator, can they really enforce this?
That's a real question, Melissa. I think as long as we let them enforce it, they can. And you're right, we shouldn't be paying it either. This is a version of taxation without representation, which is something that I thought we did away with a long time ago. But what they've essentially said is we're going to tax the American traveling public and American air carriers over your airspace, which is without precedent. They can control their airspace under the Chicago Convention in 1944. Each country is allowed to do things in its airspace, but imposing a tax on travel, as you mentioned, from a city in the United States to a destination in the European Union, and taxing that flight over American airspace and international airspace is completely without precedent, and the American public shouldn't stand for it, neither should our government.
So, Senator, what are you going to do about it?
Well, I've got a bill that would allow the DOT to prevent this from going into effect. We're hoping to get them on board with it. Our government could, if they wanted to, file a Section 84 petition before the International Aviation, or I should say the International Council on Aviation Organizations. But that, to me, is something that they should be doing, they're not doing, and until they do, we want to give our government as many tools as they can, as much leverage as they can, and I think the legislative solution that I put forward would help with that. So yeah. We're trying to do this on a lot of different fronts, Melissa, but the fact of the matter is it's wrong for them to do that. It's an unfair and illegal tax. It's a violation of American sovereignty, and we shouldn't permit it.
It seems like this is another bonehead move by the EU because it's going to cost $3 billion between now and 2020. The airlines aren't going to absorb that cost. They're going to pass it right along to their flyers by making the tickets more expensive. So if it's more expensive to fly to Europe, you're not going to do it. Who needs tourism and business right now more than the collapsing European Union, right?
Right, but I think what they see too is they see a revenue stream here, and of course, as you know, they've got lots of problems, fiscal problems in Europe. Theoretically, this is going to be used to offset aviation emissions in Europe, but there's no stipulation to that effect. This tax would be applied, and they could use it for whatever they want to. So in effect, you could have the American taxpayer bailing out European countries. And again, on so many levels, this is just completely wrong and something that the American people shouldn't have to tolerate. And that's why we're trying to light a fire under the administration to get them to more actively contest this and to get legislation moving that would allow our government to prevent the American carriers from having to pay for it and then also having to pass it on, which is essentially what they're going to do. The traveling public, as you mentioned, is going to pay higher airfares because of this, and that's something that we shouldn't tolerate.
But don't you think they're just not going to go to Europe at the end of the day? Fewer people will go?
Well, I think that could happen. I think it's unfortunate that if they do go, they're going to be paying higher airfares as a result of something that the EU did that is without precedent and is a violation of American sovereignty, and something that, again, I think the American people ought to be very exercised about. And I think when they find out that they're paying a tax so that they can fly to Europe, there may be people who will protest that and decide they're not going to fly. But yeah. The simple reality is this is an economic issue, obviously, for the American traveling public and for American air carriers. And it's also a jobs issue. I mean, if you're spending $3.1 billion like our air carriers are going to have to pay over the next 8 years in order to comply with this, it means they're not going to be hiring people here in this country and creating jobs. So it's, like I said, it's wrong on a lot of levels and it needs to be stopped.
Senator Thune, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Melissa.